It seems to me that these norms or rules are global to some extent, even when you introduce the stochasticity, it is the same for each agent, right?
Yeah, right.
So have you tried to adapt it or looked into adapting it to have more individual predisposition in agents, like having a grumpy agent and a more optimistic one, because that's usually how people work.
Right. So this is a very good question. So actually we made an assumption of public assessment where the reputation is shared without disagreement. And if we deduct this assumption, then the situation becomes drastically changed. And it is called private assessment. And it is a very hot topic these days. And I cannot explain. So overall, generally speaking, with private assessment, it is harder to maintain cooperation, obviously, because disagreement can escalate as the time goes. So in order to overcome this problem, we need to introduce some kind of mechanisms to fix disagreement. So yeah, this is a hot topic. So maybe you might want to check some of the reference. So if you check if you Google search with private assessment indirect reciprocity, then there you will find some papers.
Okay, thank you.
I guess we have time for one more question while the next presentation is being set up. Is there any final question for the speaker?
So
I think it's best to use the mic to let the online
I saw somebody else
audience also hear.
in Google Slides like this.
Okay, thank you very much for a great talk. I want to ask about the assessment of the recipient's reputations. It's kind of a quick chance if you immediately give a good reputation to someone who is just been punished. Maybe you can consider more sort of neutral reputation if someone is just punished instead of getting a good reputation immediately. They just get under review sort of reputations.
Yeah. So that is also a very interesting direction. And actually, we don't know the effect of. So probably the most likely, if we introduce another social state like neutral reputation, then the situation will be quite different. And actually, in one of our previous papers, we studied the indirect reciprocity with trinary reputation. So good, neutral, and bad. And there we didn't introduce dual reputation, but we only considered single reputation. Even in that case, we found something here. So it must be a very interesting direction.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you very much.
And then it looks like we are ready for our third speaker. So now we'll have a talk on fundamental visual navigation algorithms, indirect sequential, biased diffusive, and direct pathing. And you may use this microphone here.
Okay. All right. So one thing I would like to note, I don't really appreciate other algorithms. I would prefer this session to be known as the generalists or the boundary surfers. No borders, no walls. So I'm Patrick, and I would like to present to you my exploration to the algorithmic space of visual navigation using simulated agents. Fundamental is a big claim. Let's see if I live up to this. So using David Marr's levels to scaffold my approach into the high level of the task in the environment and the low level of the implementational level, I view these both as constraining the algorithmic level, which I am interested in. And the hypothesis goes is that if you design the high and the low to be sufficiently expressive, or rather to mirror biology, and if the low is sufficiently expressive to house the algorithmic. Upon training, represents in convergence in the representational space, and you can see similar behavior perhaps in the artificial, as well as mirroring that of the biological. I am specifically interested in navigation to known destinations that is distinct from a search process, and I am interested in using vision as the only sensory modality given its broad ubiquity across the animal kingdom and particular relevance to us. And specifically using a minimal approach in order to maximize generalizability. As much as possible, I would minimize assumptions, but of course I need to make assumptions. This is my environment where the agent cannot directly perceive where it's trying to go to, which I will be calling a patch, a foraging patch. In order to get to the patch, it must perceive, it must use its perception of 4 boundary walls, which is viewable with a raycast, which allows the agent a one-hot encoded representation of the environment in front of it, which then confers some landmark properties to the corners of the environment. And a more complex version of this perception will be to scale this the rays which collide with the boundary walls with distance, and that's an abstraction of parallax perceptual ability to estimate depth, as well as memory of the boundary wall height in order to judge distance. And I will be logarithmically scaling that distance. And the visual encoding is then passed to a CNN and a single layer perceptron, which outputs a single scalar action, which represents directly the turning angle left to right, which then scales to the speed through a linear hat, and then updates the position and orientation of the agent in the next time step. The hard part of this problem is that the agent is initialized randomly in each simulation, thus forcing the agent to learn spatial invariances of the perceptual environment in order to get to the patch, given its limited, perception and action constraints that you can see here. So this perception action loop agent is trained via evolutionary strategies, and the performance is judged on the time taken to reach the patch plus the remaining distance if the agent doesn't reach the patch. And the visual encoding without angles, without distance, it learns the task sufficiently, and scaling in distance approaches the theoretical lower bound of direct trajectories to the patch. Mind you, this is an agent that does not perceive the patch directly. It's using relative distance of the walls, which, so I suppose we can infer what sort of behavior that looks like. So what does the angle-based vision behavior look like? This is one type of agent which you can see learns to compose these series of long straight segments interrupted by major turns, resulting in a sort of grid-like trajectory that I will call indirect sequential agents. And interestingly, another type of agent learns something completely different. So its strategy is rather evocative of the Gabriel's planary talk of olfaction. It looks a lot like chemotaxis, I suppose. And it's by spinning and ratcheting its way towards the patch. I call this the bias diffusive class. And interestingly, repeatedly, the agents bifurcate into these two classes. So we looked at a video of one initialization for each type of class that you can see in the first row. By initializing the agent in a sweep across the grid, we can construct a trajectory map, which looks like a phase plot, but the trajectories can overlap. The agents can have multiple different orientations. Looking across the rows, these are different evolutionary runs, just representing the sort of diversity, yet similarity within clusters, within these classes, and the significant difference between classes, between the first and the second row. What's interesting to me that pops out right away is the indirect sequential agents learn these sort of global elliptical manifolds in order to make those major turns that we saw in the video. And we'll get to that later. But what does it look like for the agents that have distance information encoded into their visual input? Well, unsurprisingly, the agent looks around and learns to walk directly to the patch. And these maps, I call them the direct pathing agents. And these maps look like sort of sinks or attractors, which they learn to place directly onto the middle of the patch. And okay, so then the question becomes how to quantify this obvious qualitative difference between the classes and how to maybe modulate or see how to change the evolvability and the preference between the classes. So I won't be getting into the details of two metrics that I use to look at this clustering, but I'll call them spatial correlation and temporal correlation, just to speed things up. And as we looked at before, by scaling in distance information, you can find the emergence of the direct pathing class. And interestingly, I found visual resolution to modulate between the other two classes. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Looking at this data in another way, in a heat map, it's clear that there is a clustering where each of these points is a different evolutionary run, by the way. And the fitnesses can show a higher fitness for walking directly to the patch, unsurprisingly. And the other two types of agents are comparable, at least if the agents learn a strategy that places them within the cluster centers of this, spatial temporal correlation map. As you can see, the outliers don't perform as well, or the hybrids, on average, I would say. And so visual resolution then shows a modulation between the classes. Here's a better representation of what you saw in that first plot, where the indirect sequential agents IS evolve more readily at lower visual resolution, whereas the spinning chemotactic bias diffusers evolve more readily at higher visual resolution. And you can see in the right, there's a sort of hybrid zone, which is a little bit difficult to classify the sort of agents in the middle that seem to have properties of both. But on the most part, you can cluster them pretty well. And by scaling in distance information, you can see this interesting titration curve that I would say is, as the distance information becomes computationally usable in this network, this type evolves more readily, given the higher fitness that is conferred from walking directly to the patch. Okay, so we looked at an artificial system, and what I'm interested personally is how that relates at all to biology. And so emerging from my simulation cave, I stumbled across Morris water maze, which is a classical experimental paradigm I haven't heard about, but looks a lot like my simulations. If you don't know, the rodents are placed into a cloudy pool of water and then encouraged to find this hidden platform submerged below the surface of the water. And in order to do that, they need to correlate the visual landmarks in a sort of allocentric representation, as I discussed before. There's been a number of studies. These are just two shown that have sought to characterize the variety of strategies that the agents learn to reach this patch reliably, and three of which seem to overlap with the three behaviors that I've seen in my agents to some extent. Their characterization boundaries look a little bit different from my characterization boundaries. So who knows, if you re-look at this data, what you would find. But interestingly, sort of relative fitness metrics and occurrence metrics seem to more or less line up with what I've seen in my system. Interestingly, the three classes, as you can see to the right, is kind of robust over time. More to look at there. And second instance of convergence is the bias diffusive class, as we discussed in the plenary talk and shown in the plenary talk, that looks like sperm cell chemotaxis that sort of creates this helices as it progresses towards an egg. The difference being is that these cells sample concentration, whereas my agents visually observe landmarks, and results in a sort, and what's underlying is actually an explicit gradient in signal in the case of sperm cells, but my agents have to indirectly infer this sort of spatial gradient, which I find kind of interesting. I'm working on the circuits of this. I haven't really gotten you to something for prime time yet, but and then the third case, real quick, perhaps the most interesting, is came out of Ian Cousins' lab, which some of you may know. Recently, there was fruit flies, desert locusts, and zebrafish, not shown here, that were asked to choose between two spatial choices, and the majority of the animals tend to follow a median line, delaying the choice as much as possible, and then spontaneously chooses between one or the other option. What you're seeing is collective, average behavior in this heat map. And importantly, if this 2 becomes 3, it results in a double bifurcation of binary spatial choices. They use a ring attractor model to reproduce this successfully. And interestingly, if you change that origin to other points, it creates an ellipse that startlingly similar to my agents. However, there are some differences. This is a goal choice task, and in our case, it was indirect spatial inference, and they use the collision with the ellipses to scaffold routes rather than make this one or binary choice. And they have some differences in the perceptual and cognitive assumptions there, which really just show the fundamental nature of this phenomenon rather, which then I would take a stab at. We're both taking a stab at actually Euclidean cognitive maps. It's not all Euclidean cognitive maps, folks, is the hot take. Let's see how that goes. So as we've seen, there was a set of minimal task, environment, perception, action constraints that upon training resulted And the first key takeaway is a bifurcation in angle-based strategy, plus this third option if you add in some sort of ability to judge distance. And they seem to converge on behavior that appears similar to rodents, insects, fish, and sperm cells. And right now I'm working on explaining the sort of circuit mechanisms behind the two angle-based strategies a little bit more. I have some intuition we can talk about if you're interested, but it's not ready right now. And we'll be extending this to a social system. Thank you.